Hello, my classical guitar people. So, in this video, we are going to be actually starting the piece. Now, as I've said in previous videos, the piece that we're going to be working with is Study in B Minor by Fernando Sor, Opus 35, number 22. It's a piece that I've picked out because I think that if we go through it together, it has a lot of the material that you need to be able to learn how to work through a piece on classical guitar. Now, I highly recommend that instead of, like I said in my last video, going online and searching for the piece, because you can find copies of this piece online, I highly recommend going to the Making Space in Music website and finding the link that I have provided of my arrangement of this piece, because I have notated this piece so that it is as simple as possible. Mine is more clear, it's shorter, and also has more of easy to understand notations than perhaps a copy you'd find online. So make sure that you're accessing the copy that I provided on the Making Space in Music website. Looking at the piece, I know it may look a little scary, but we are going to go through it together, and I think you'll find that it's not as scary as it looks. So, if we're looking at the piece, we see some notation going on like we talked about in the last video. We see the M-I-P-I-M-I pattern above the musical line, which obviously, like we talked about, refers to which notes we are going to be using for the right hand. We also see numbers 1 through 4 next to the notes, which shows us which finger on the left hand we're going to be pressing down for those specific notes. We also see that bracket with the C2 over top. Don't worry about that yet. We will get into that later in the video. But by now, I hope that you've noticed that there is a pattern going on within the right hand. So to start this piece, I think it'd be really helpful to just isolate and practice the right hand pattern without even worrying about the left hand. So, how do we do that? Well, one of the things that we have to know before we do these exercises is specifically what string are we supposed to play each note on? What open string does that correspond to? And what I mean by that is, as you see in the first measure, we start out with a B. Now, what string do we play that on? Well, we know that a B is right here, so if we were to play that on an open string, we would be playing that on A. Same thing goes for the D in the top voice on the very first note. We play that D here. So if we were to play it on an open string, we play it on this second string. So this requires an understanding of what we covered in the last video about really getting comfortable with where those notes are. So please see my last video if you're confused about notes and where they are on the guitar. But that being said, we see our right hand pattern, and if we can just practice this right hand pattern on open strings, it'll be really beneficial to when we put it together with the left hand, because our right hand won't be fumbling for which specific fingers we're going to use. So, as we see in the first measure, we start with our M finger on the second string and our P finger, the thumb, on the fifth string, and they are played at the same time on beat 1. Don't worry about how it sounds. This is only for the mechanism of learning how to move the right hand. This is not supposed to sound correct because we haven't added in the correct notes with the left hand yet. So, beat 1, then we go to a B, but instead of playing it open, as you see on that little 4 next to it, like we talked about, that means that that B, instead of being played on the second string, is going to be played on the third string. So, we start out 5th string and 2nd string open together, then the 3rd string, then we're going to go to that F sharp, which will be played on the D string, then back with I to the 3rd string, M again, and I again. So, that is the pattern that we have. Again, I'm just looking at the letters over top that correspond to middle, index, thumb, and sped up, that pattern is going to look like this. Remember to use proper right hand posture, so make sure that your right arm is touching the guitar in the right place, that your fingers are over the sound hole, that you're moving from big knuckle and not middle knuckle, and practice that pattern a couple times, just because of how much it shows up in this piece. Now, something else that we have to take into account is that we're always using the same fingers, but we're not always using them on the same strings. So take it, for example, between the first two measures. We start out with that pattern we just practiced. However, in the second measure, our middle finger is going to move up a string to that first string, as we're going to be playing an F sharp, which is played on the first string, then to a D, which is played on the second string. Keep that thumb on the fourth string. So even though it is the same pattern, it is on different strings. So make sure that you're also paying attention to what strings each pattern is on, not just playing this pattern over again. It is helpful to play that pattern multiple times, but what's even more helpful is to go through the piece like so. So I just played the first line, making sure that in each spot where the notes changed to different strings, I was also changing my fingers to fit that exercise to the proper open string that it is played on. So the first step is to play that right hand pattern, keeping in mind on which open string it is to get comfortable with that right hand. Now, next we're going to talk about what exactly that C2 with the bracket means. So, I don't know if you remember, but when I was first discussing how to put the left hand on the guitar, when we talked about how first position, what we call first position, is when we have our index finger over the first fret, middle finger over the second fret, third finger over the third fret. So this is known as first position. However, there are multiple positions that we play in. So let's say that instead we moved our index finger to second fret, our middle finger to third fret, and our third finger to fourth fret. This would be known as second position because we are starting with our index finger on the second fret. So that is what that 2 refers to in the C2. So we know that instead of starting the piece in first position, we are going to be starting the piece with our fingers over second position. Now, what that C in the bracket means is that we are going to be starting the piece with something called a bar. Now, when we're playing guitar, I'm sure as you've seen people play acoustic guitar, they can use something called a capo. Now this modulates the key so that if we put it on, we can use the same fingers but play a chord higher than if we played it without the capo. So this is used by acoustic guitarists mostly. Now, with classical guitar, we don't often use capos, especially when we're moving in and out of what chords we would use a capo on, because if we decided to put a capo over 2 to start this piece, we would have to take it off in the third measure. That wouldn't make sense. We wouldn't have time to do that within the piece. So instead, we do something what's called a bar. And basically, a bar is mimicking the shape of that capo and the function of that capo, but with your first finger. So, what that will look like is you take your first finger, make sure that your thumb is still in its proper place in the back of the guitar, and we're in second position starting out. You take your first finger and you press down about where, not on top of the fret line, but right below the fret line where we play our notes. Press down so that when you go through each note, they all sound as if you were holding them down with one finger. Now this can be really tricky when you're getting started, not only because it takes a certain amount of strength from your finger, but also because of the ways that our finger is made up. We have, where the joints are, little grooves. Now, if you accidentally have one of the strings in one of those joint grooves, your string is going to be muffled and not sing out properly. So it's all about finding what position works best for you to the point where you don't have any muffled strings. You could kind of hear that that top note was a little muffled. So I will have to reposition my hand to make sure that that note is not muffled. So that is what a bar is. Now, bars are usually still accompanied by us putting our other fingers down when we're playing chords or when we're playing a piece like this. However, the marking of the C2 in the bracket simply means we are going to have a bar with our first finger on second position, second fret. Now, starting to look at the piece and putting that left hand together, we're going to take it note by note. So we see that our thumb on the bass note on the first beat is going to play A, B. Now, because we have that bar down, our first finger is already holding down that B for us to play. So that is taken care of by the bar. Now, when we look at the melody note, we see a 2 next to that D, that high D, which means we know that on the left hand, we have to use our middle finger, place that 2 on the D. So that would be what our first beat would sound like. Moving on to the and of 1, we have a B, but instead of being played open, we can't play it open because we're barring still. We're barring until the bracket ends. So because we still have our bar down, we need to find another place to play that B. Now, as I've talked about with the 5th fret, you can play that B on the 4th fret of the 3rd string. And that checks out as it's telling us by that tiny 4 notated next to the B to use our 4th finger. So, hold down our bar, then the 4th finger here, then we're going to be playing a F sharp with our 3rd finger. Just hold down that 4 the whole time and that 2 the whole time and the 4 down. So that is what your first measure is going to sound like. Now, something that's not specifically notated in the piece, but is extremely important when we're talking about classical guitar, is that you should always try and make each note ring over to the next note. Now, what does that mean? That means instead of playing, and then when we go to play the next note, picking up our middle finger because we're done playing that note, you want to hold that second finger down for as long as possible so you can get that nice connected resonant sound that is usual in the classical guitar sound. So always try and hold the notes for the duration of the measure at least until you have to shift your hand to the next form. So if we're looking at measure 2, we've just played this beautiful B minor chord. Then we go up. Also make sure that you're using the correct fingers in your right hand for this, like what we did with our exercise. This is why it's important to do the exercise first. We see that we're playing an F sharp, but we're still holding down our bar because the bracket is not over yet, and we're still holding that B bass note. So again, I'm just using the same process for finding notes. We haven't moved any of our fingers on the right hand. We're still holding all of them down throughout those 2 measures. So that is how you would go about going through each measure. So now that I've taken you through the first couple measures of this piece, I think it's important that you try and use that process that I just taught you to take yourself through the rest of the piece. So I'm not going to go through every single measure, but I am going to look at some of the perhaps trickier spots in this little excerpt of this piece. So, one of the things that you might have noticed if you have already played your way through the piece is that there is a change in the last measure of the third line from the original melody. So, in measure 9, we start back with the same melody that we started with at the beginning, that we just learned how to play. And then we're going to shift our hand 1 fret up. So play that D with 1, that B with 2, that G with 3. So we know that because there are those fingerings next to it, we know that instead of playing that D and G open, we're going to be playing them closed on the strings beforehand using that 5th fret technique. So again, I'll take you through that. We start with the same exact bar, same exact form at measure 9. And we shift 1 up, 1 fret up. So that is an issue you may have run into when going through the notes of this piece. Another tricky spot is the measure right after. So when we're going, so you're going to take your entire hand off of the guitar, move that 2 as we see, because it's going to need to play that C sharp. And then we have that bass note on the 3rd beat. So just about remembering that that thumb is going to have to chime in on the 3rd beat. And then slide back up into our left hand formation. And then this last measure, the fingering may seem a little weird at first, but just make sure that, just practice that transition from the second to last measure to moving that 4 up to the B, moving that 1 up to the 2, playing the D, keeping the 3 on that F sharp, and placing that 1 on that B. So now that we've worked through how to figure out where that left hand goes in the piece, how to figure out where that right hand goes in the piece, our next and final video is going to be talking about the final touches that we place on a piece, practice techniques for getting it to sound professional, and how we can really make that music shine.